The rain fell heavily on the sleepy town of Marrow Creek, its rhythm a constant drumming against the rooftops, the streets, and the trees that lined them. The town had been quiet for weeks, a sharp contrast to the storm that had now turned the night into a dark, soggy blur. Only a few determined souls braved the elements, their hurried footsteps creating brief splashes on the wet pavement as they sought shelter. The clouds hung low, thick and oppressive, and the streetlights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows over the houses that lined Oak Street. In the heart of the storm, the Thompson house sat shrouded in silence. The small, weathered building seemed to bend against the wind, its paint peeling like the skin of an old man who had lived too long in the same place. Inside, only the faint hum of a single bulb and the occasional creak of the house filled the emptiness. The light flickered above a girl who sat curled up in the corner of the living room. Tanya Thompson, just 14, with her wide eyes and pale skin, looked like a ghost in the shadows. Her arms wrapped tightly around her knees as she sat on the threadbare carpet, her dark hair matted and tangled. She didn't move, not even when the door slammed open, causing the light to flicker again. For uniformed officers, their faces grim and cold, stepped inside. The officers had come quickly, summoned by the frantic phone call from a neighbor who had heard strange sounds coming from the house. Tanya didn't speak, didn't even look up when they entered. She was too lost in her own thoughts, too trapped by the weight of the secret that had been gnawing at her for days, weeks, maybe even years. The officers, 3 men and 1 woman, stood in the center of the room, their boots leaving muddy marks on the floor. They exchanged a few words, their voices hushed, but Tanya didn't hear them. She was too focused on the way the rain pattered against the windows, the way the storm seemed to echo through her bones. It wasn't until one of them, a tall man with a buzz cut and dark circles under his eyes, stepped forward and knelt down in front of her that she finally acknowledged their presence. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, but Tanya didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge the contact. She just stared ahead, her gaze distant, as if she were looking at something far beyond the room. "Tanya," the officer said softly, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk to you. What happened here tonight? Where's your father?" The words cut through the thick silence, and for the first time, Tanya's eyes shifted, though her face remained unreadable. Her father. She had been waiting for someone to ask. She had been waiting for this moment, though she hadn't known what to do with it once it arrived. Her lips trembled and her chest tightened, but she forced herself to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "I told you he's not dead." The officer blinked, clearly taken aback by the response. He straightened up, exchanging a confused look with his colleagues. "What do you mean by that, Tanya?" he asked, his voice now tinged with concern. "We need to know where he is." The girl's fingers dug into the worn carpet as she fought to keep her composure. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the anger and the fear that had been building up for years. It was too much, all of it. The secret, the lies, the terror. Everything was spilling out of her now, and she couldn't hold it back any longer. "I told you," she repeated, her voice growing a little stronger now. "He's under the floorboards." The officer's confusion deepened. He glanced quickly at his fellow officers, none of whom seemed to understand either. One of them, a woman with short black hair and a stern expression, cleared her throat, taking a cautious step forward. "Tanya," the woman said, her tone gentle but firm, "we understand you're upset, but your father's missing. We need to find him. Do you understand?" Tanya's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream, to tell them everything, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she remained silent, staring at the floor beneath her, her eyes narrowing as though she could will the truth to rise from the wooden boards. "He's not gone," she whispered again, this time with a quiet intensity. "He's under the floorboards." The officer stepped back, clearly confused and unsure of how to proceed. Tanya's words didn't make sense. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no mess. The house was eerily calm, almost too calm. But Tanya had been insistent, and her eyes, there was something in them, a darkness that unsettled him. "Sweetheart," the officer said after a long pause, "we know you're scared, but we need to know where he is. We can't help you if you don't tell us the truth. No, Tanya cried, her voice rising sharply, the tremor now evident. You don't understand. He's under the floorboards. He's not dead. The words echoed in the silence that followed, thick with the weight of their meaning. For a moment, the officers were frozen. No one spoke, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Tanya's breath came in short, quick gasps as she stared at the floor, her face twisted in a mixture of grief and something darker, something colder. Finally, Officer Stevens, the one who had spoken to her earlier, seemed to realize that she wasn't going to speak anymore. He stepped closer, his voice low, but soothing, almost coaxing. Tanya, he said, can you show us where? Please, we need to see. Tanya hesitated, her body rigid as if she were holding herself back from some invisible force. For a long moment, she didn't move, but then, slowly, with a deliberateness that sent a chill through the room, she stood. Her legs wobbled slightly beneath her, but she straightened them with an almost unnatural grace. She moved toward the center of the room, where the wooden floorboards creaked under her weight. The officers followed her, their eyes never leaving her as she crouched down in front of the floor. She reached out with trembling fingers, brushing over the old wood with the lightest of touches. The floorboards had been there for years, creaky and cracked, but they were still solid, still able to hide what Tanya had buried deep inside. Her hand hovered over a specific spot, and then with a quiet tap, she touched the wood once more. The room seemed to hold its breath as Tanya looked up at the officers with cold, empty eyes. Her secret was out now. It was time. The hours passed slowly as the officers continued to work, their tools scraping and pounding against the wooden floorboards. The once quiet house was now alive with the noise of their desperate excavation, the rhythmic sound of metal against wood filling the space. Tanya remained in the corner, still as a statue, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Despite the chaos around her, her face remained unreadable, her eyes locked on the spot where her father had been hidden. The officers, on the other hand, were anything but still. They moved with an urgency fueled by confusion and disbelief, but each of them carried a deep, nagging sense of unease. They had expected some kind of strange, twisted discovery. After all, the girl had insisted her father was under the floorboards, but no one could have prepared for the horror that would greet them when they finally breached the hidden space. The smell, at first faint and then growing stronger with each moment, was the first sign that they were crossing into uncharted territory. It was the scent of something rotten, of decay, the unmistakable stench of death itself. The officers hesitated, their faces contorting with the overwhelming smell, their stomachs turning at the heaviness of it. They exchanged nervous glances, but they pressed on, knowing there was no turning back now. What had started as a simple investigation into a missing person had morphed into something far darker, and they needed answers. They couldn't afford to stop. As the last of the floorboards were lifted, the full weight of the truth became clear. There, buried in the dirt beneath the house, lay the body of a man. The man was unrecognizable, his skin a sickly shade of pale, his eyes wide open and frozen in a deathly stare. The body was wrapped in a tattered blanket, the edges frayed and soaked in what was now a mixture of decay and moisture. He had been there for days, maybe even longer, and the stench was unbearable. Tanya, however, didn't flinch. Her eyes didn't widen with shock or horror. She merely stood, watching the scene unfold with a strange, eerie calmness. To her, this was no revelation. This was simply the truth she had been carrying for so long, a truth that had festered beneath the floorboards of her life for as long as she could remember. One of the officers, a man with a soft face and a shaky voice, gagged at the overwhelming odor. He stumbled back, his hand covering his nose, but the others remained focused, their minds working overtime to process what they were witnessing. Officer Stevens, the one who had been speaking to Tanya earlier, took a cautious step forward. His face was pale, his jaw tight, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. "But why?" he asked, his voice quivering with both disbelief and fear. "Why did you hide him here, Tanya?" Tanya's eyes flicked to him, her expression eerily calm. She hadn't cried, hadn't shown the slightest hint of fear. Her composure was unsettling, unnatural even. She turned to face him, her lips parting in a quiet, steady response. "You don't understand," she said softly, her voice carrying a chilling conviction. "He wasn't the man you thought he was. He was a monster, and I had to protect everyone. He would have hurt people, he would have hurt me. So I did what I had to do." Her words were simple, but the gravity behind them hung in the air like an invisible weight, crushing everyone who heard them. Tanya didn't seem broken by what had transpired. She seemed detached, as though the violence and the horror of her actions had become a necessary evil, a burden she was willing to bear. She turned away from the officers, her gaze drifting toward the window, as though seeking some kind of solace in the rain that had begun to pour outside. Her mind raced, replaying the countless nights of fear, of torment. The sounds of her father's rage were still fresh in her mind, the images of him standing over her, of the cruelty he had inflicted upon her, burned into her memories like scars that would never fade. Tanya had lived in constant terror of him. She had spent her life hiding in dark corners, praying he wouldn't notice her, praying he wouldn't hurt her. "I tried to stop him," Tanya continued, her voice still soft but unyielding. "But in the end, it was either him or me." She swallowed hard, but there was no tremor in her words. "So I made him disappear. He's been under the floorboards all this time, but no one ever asked the right questions." The officers stood frozen, the weight of her confession settling heavily in the room. They had thought they were prepared for the worst, but this was beyond anything they had imagined. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking into place, but they were left with more questions than answers. Officer Stevens took a step back, his mind racing as he tried to process everything Tanya had just revealed. His hands trembled as he reached for his notepad, scribbling down notes in an attempt to regain some semblance of control over the situation. His instincts told him to act quickly, but his heart told him to tread carefully. Tanya had been living with a burden no child should have to bear, but she had done what she believed was necessary to survive. The idea of a child killing their parent, though, was still hard to grasp. As the officers began to document the scene and take photographs, one of them, a young man with a sharp jawline, noticed something unusual. He reached down, running his hand over the back of one of the floorboards that had been removed. There was something there, something carved into the wood, something that didn't belong. He pulled the floorboard closer, carefully inspecting the markings, then called out to the others. The officers crowded around, squinting at the strange, jagged scratches that marred the surface. It was a message, scratched hastily, almost frantically. "I'm not gone. I'll return when the time is right." Tanya's eyes widened as she saw the message. Her body stiffened, and for the first time since they had uncovered the body, she looked genuinely unsettled. A shiver ran down her spine, and her voice barely broke the silence that followed. "He's still here," she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, the air in the room suddenly thick with an unsettling tension. The words etched into the floorboard were not just the ramblings of a man who had been dead. They were a warning, a promise, perhaps. And as much as the officers wanted to deny it, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were now dealing with something far darker, far more dangerous than a simple case of domestic violence gone wrong. Tanya, still staring at the message, was now lost in her thoughts. The faintest flicker of fear crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with the same cold, determined look she had worn since the beginning. She had done what she had to do to survive, but now it seemed as though her past was coming back to haunt her, literally. The officers knew they were facing something they couldn't easily explain away. The mystery had only deepened, and the truth that had been buried under the floorboards was far more complex, far more twisted than they could have imagined. The quiet town of Marrow Creek, with its sleepy streets and placid houses, was suddenly not so innocent. And Tanya Thompson, the girl who had quietly buried her father in the darkness, was no longer just a witness. She was at the center of something far more sinister, and the storm outside seemed like a mere whisper compared to the tempest that was about to break loose.